And for anyone who's just catching up in the middle of this recording, please review the slides. Anyway, I'm going to go through the steps of localizing blocks in the JavaScript implementation. Most of the steps here are the same if you're using the iOS version, except the string save formats are just a raw JSON file, a dictionary. But in the JavaScript version, we're loading JavaScript files. They have to be pulled from the file system directly. So we're actually just using variable assignments into the array. So the first step in localizing your own blocks is to store the strings in a string table. So we're going to go through our block definitions, such as the JSON block here, and move that into a English-specific string, and this is going to be assigned into blockly.message with whatever key name that we're using to identify this string. So the strings are going to be including, in the context of the message text, the strings are actually going to include the interpolation tokens that reference the fields and the inputs of these block definitions. And so here we have the %1 and the %2, and hopefully this is looking familiar. Anyone who's defined their blocks using the JSON format, this is how we get our word ordering. The %1 and the 1 and 2 in this case are actually indices into the argument array. So we have message 0 referencing back to the assigned variable, and the first one, the %1, refers to the first element. Notice this is base 1 indexing for the variable field, and then %2 references the input that's getting assigned to that. So at the bottom, we actually have that block rendered. We assign the variable to the value in the input. So then we want to replace the strings. Now, since we have two different block definitions, I first wanted to very quickly describe what's going on in the JavaScript-based definitions. And this is very, very simple. We are just referencing directly into the array. So we're going to append the field that is blockly.message, doit text, as doit text is the key that we used when we extracted the string. We don't have, when we're using this direct reference, we don't have any automated support for word or field ordering, and there's no drop-down field support for prefix and suffix matching, which I'll explain in just a few minutes. We generally encourage people to, particularly if they're using localization, to use the JSON-based block definitions. You get this and many other benefits, including kind of isolation from API changes as we evolve Blockly. So when we're looking at JSON definitions for your blocks, we have this notation that probably looks a little strange. It's kind of an extension of the interpolation tokens. Instead of %1, %2, we have % in the curly brackets. And I will explain the BKY prefix in a little bit, but your reference, your assignment to Blockly message doit text then becomes % curly brace BKY underscore doit text, and then closing the key name with the ending close bracket. And so therefore we get block text in your block. And this is more than just the messages. In the JSON definitions, this can be used kind of all over the place in block definition. So yes, we have the message references, but we also have things such as maybe the default field value for variables or text or numbers. Tooltips are something that needs to be localized. Oftentimes, help URLs need to be localized. So you'll see in the standard block definitions, we actually point to different versions of Wikipedia to describe things like loops. Help URLs go. Images can be localized. Sometimes images include text. Sometimes they're dependent upon whether it is a left to right or right to left language. Since images are something that can be replaced, we also have localization. We're using the localization method to also allow you to swap out the size markers for the string, so the width and the height of an image. And for the image elements, this applies both to image fields as well as images that are inserted into items in dropdowns. For anyone who didn't know, dropdowns can contain images. And then you'll also see that color is used. And this was possibly a poor decision, but it actually seems to work pretty well in terms of centralizing the one place to set your color palette for a block category. We just kind of lean on the string table to say that like all logic blocks will be here, and then using this the string table reference, that becomes a one place to change it for all of the blocks in that category. And that's going to be interesting to change as we look at how to update palettes as a whole, as Eric talked about in the accessibility. So finally, we want to add new languages. So we're going to make use the first language file for the string table as a template for creating all of our other strings. The final output that's going to be used by Blockly at runtime is going to be more JavaScript files that have their own string assignments. So this means that we're in each of these files, we have different assignments to the string table, to the blockly.message array. So in these cases, I've been able to make my block text into mon texte de bloc, and I'm not going to read the Japanese or the Hindi equivalents, but there we have 3 different blocks, so your system will then load in the right file. So this means that on the client side or the server side, you have to select which script gets loaded in. It's not ideal. I'll talk about some alternatives in the future, but we do have at least one example of how to do this on the client side. So in the demos/code, at the very end of that file is a little segment that reads in what code language is being passed in from the URL parameter, and then loads this script so that the right JavaScript string table is loaded in, and then we add a load event for the window. So basically waiting for that JavaScript to be fully loaded into the system. And then we continue on with our initialization and our blockly.inject. So how are we doing this internally for all of our standard blocks? Some of you who have tried to rebuild Blockly will be familiar with the build.py script that comes with Blockly. In addition to going through the closure compiler, this is taking the messages, the MSG/messages JavaScript, and outputting a JSON variation of this. This gets pulled occasionally by the Translate wiki team, and then we have a crowdsourced. All of our strings are translated through this crowdsourcing website. As they get updates, they will commit back to us as new JSON files, and the other half of the build.python will convert those JSON files into the JavaScript files that are used at runtime by Blockly. So these sorts of scripting solutions are probably very useful if you're actually trying to do a large-scale translation system. The Scratch team has done something similar. They have a JavaScript and JS Node solution. I forget what platform that they're, Chris, doing.
Yeah, we use a service called translators for crowdsourcing.
Okay, so Scratch has their script to use Transifex, which is also a crowdsourcing solution. These are two examples that you can use to help script your own translation and localization efforts. And so getting into some of the deeper details here, or special features, I mentioned previously that JavaScript implementation does not support things such as handling drop-down prefixes and suffixes. And so what I meant by this is that sometimes in translations, we have a shared segment of the text that looks odd when you try and put that inside a drop-down, because all the drop-downs look like they start with the same thing. It's very hard to visually pick out like which one you're looking for. So Neil added some code a long time ago before I got involved in this that actually looks for those prefixes and extracts them as field labels when constructing the block. So in this case, here is our math is block. And all of the solutions here are that, like, is a number even? Is it odd? Is it prime? Is it whole? But that may not be the right linguistic form for other languages. If I move on here, like if we move to Hungarian, we'll see that doing whole, you don't describe whole numbers in the same way. And so you want to give your translators this flexibility and make the drop-down strings as large as possible. So what you may think of as the right string boundaries when you're making your drop-downs may be biased by your own language. Try and make them as broad as possible so that the system just kind of does the right thing and the translators have the flexibility they need to use the right terminology. Another issue, if anyone ever wondered what the zero was in the message zero, you can actually enforce multiple breaks in the block definition. I don't think it always translates into new lines as is listed here. I'd have to double check that. But we use this in our loops so that we have the do line as its own unique element. And so in this case, we have the first line, the repeat 10 times. That's coming from message 0. And then message 1 has the do statement just prior to the C block, the statement input that allows you to connect all the other blocks. And so if you're trying to enforce this separation of concepts in all the blocks across all the languages, do use this message 0, message 1 sort of interfaces. So caveats for this system that we have. We do not have a out-of-the-box solution for hot swapping languages. In other words, we don't have a means to change the language after Blockly has been loaded. A lot of this comes down to having using a single array and overriding the array values every time we load in a new JavaScript file. It has been done. Scratch is a good solution to look at in terms of how they've done hot swapping of languages. Doing this does imply that you have to save the workspace, update the string table, possibly reload all your block definitions, and then reload the workspace. This is, for most applications, a very quick operation. It's a little heavy, but there's ways to do this, and we do want to move towards adding this support in the future. We're going to have to adjust how we do string tables. Additionally, there's a risk for hash table key collisions by assigning everything to blockly.message. We want to be able to break this out. And so the BKY underscore that I showed you at the beginning for these key names is actually this future forward intent to, like, have a hook for you to assign your own string tables, so that when you have your app code and you're pulling in some third-party block definition set, all of them can have their own string definitions. And instead of referencing a singular array directly, there will be a function call that knows what prefix you're using, what the key name within that string table is, in addition to, of course, the language, to get the right string. So there's some work to be done here in making this a more complete solution for localization, but we've been thinking about it, and we built in these concepts into the code so that we will not break your code as we implement this. Finally, this is not a bulletproof localization solution. We don't have support for gender and plurals. So several languages require some sort of linguistic agreement between various words. I'm sure you've seen this if you've taken Spanish or French, and or even just in English, the pluralization of adding an S. That's not always true in all languages. So right now, the simple hash table lookup doesn't really provide that necessary parameter support. We have a couple of places in the code where we've hard-coded solutions, such as the prompt to when you delete blocks, when you clear a workspace, do you want to delete n blocks? There's some programmatic solutions that are biased towards English and other kind of European languages, and in terms of how they deal with plurals. I haven't come across a case where we've needed to deal with gender agreement, but maybe that exists. This is going to be challenging because we're going to need to figure out what we are not localization experts. We do a pretty good job, but it's going to need some research to figure out what the right, how to insert those parameters into the percentage curly brace brackets and pass that through the translators API, so that they have the means to choose the right selections. And I don't think we want to embed an entire localization solution into Blockly if it only hits a small number of people. So, but we would love input if you have potential solutions on how this might be done. I think we're open to it, but I don't think solving this particular problem is of the highest priority compared to the previous two issues. So with that, thank you very much. I'll go ahead and take questions. We are recording this time. So. Yep.
My question is the material you give a translator is obviously the string table with the English or the language you wrote your blocks in. Do you provide, or is there a pattern to follow where you provide like a complete, like a context, like here is the app with all the blocks loaded on screen. So as you edit, you can reload and see.
We do not have such a tool. I've definitely thought about such a tool because we have such a special context.
So we don't have a tool for it, but if you actually look through Blockly strings, you'll see most of the comments provide a lot of context about what the block is, what that string is used for, and a lot of them will provide a link to a small playground app that has just that block in it.
I haven't seen links in the translator comments for something like this, but like in order to make such a tool that is very Blockly specific, we're going to need to do the hot swapping of string tables. And so that is something, a reason to implement that.
Also, the translation site that we use has projects. Like you group your strings into projects, and each project has a page that lets you give context. Say this is what this is for. Say that it's aimed at this type of like aimed at students or whatever, and say these are the general guidelines for language, and from there also links for this is what it'll look like.
So let me actually pull up the messages.js file that let's see, tree master. So when we write in our translation tables, the stuff the build.py script actually takes these comments that precede each of these translations and turns it into a context file, I think called qqq.json, that is imported by TranslateWiki to give the translators the necessary context and how to deal with the interpolation tokens, the %1, %2. So this gives some description of the context but it's very specific to how we are using the build.py and the translatewiki.net.
Okay, so just to repeat back, what I think you just said was you can't just give them a way to F5 their way to success. They have to actually build it again to get those translated strings into.
Unfortunately,
Okay.
that's where a good Blockly specific tool would be a great help for our translators and for anyone who's building their own blocks with translations.
One other quick note, the translators are random volunteers on the internet, so most of them are not programmers. And so if you read through this, the context is very much giving them context about what the message meaning is. And Andrew's right, there aren't that many links. There are a few. There, you just passed one right at the top. Yeah. And those links just provide basically an image of what the block looks like so that they can see it in context. But we don't expect them to build it to look at the translation in Blockly. We just expect to get a string back that uses the context to do the best they can.
We would accept such a tool if you built it. Any other questions? Great. Go teach the world.